Ms. Howell, thanks very much for your testimony. I wanted to start a round of questions. My first question is for Ms. Cannington. We know that people with disabilities face hardships. I think that's a real understatement. They face those hardships at a rate that is higher than people without disabilities. For example, they're twice as likely to live in poverty, to face a persistent wage gap, and to struggle to afford housing costs. We've got to do more to ensure that federal housing assistance programs are both, as we've said a number of times today, accessible and affordable for people with disabilities. I mentioned LIHTC, the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit. It's the nation's primary driver of new stock affordable housing. This is a good program. It's had bipartisan support for many, many years. LIHTC provides tax credits to developers who build new housing for low-income renters, but currently there's no requirement under the program as it exists today to build disability-friendly housing. It's just a gap in the program. The VITAL Act that I've introduced would add an accessibility standard for that tax credit program, ensuring that investment in building of new, affordable, and accessible housing is possible. So here's my question, Ms. Cannington. Are states meeting the needs of people with disabilities through the LIHTC program?
Thank you, Senator Casey, for your question. So as you spoke to, LIHTC is the primary driver of affordable housing. And through LIHTC, all states are allocated tax credits. And each state, through their qualified allocation plan, can decide where those tax credits can be prioritized. There are 28 states that completely, at the state level, also lack accessibility requirements. But then there are some states that are leading the way, that are adding both accessibility requirements and incentives. But the bottom line is that disabled people and older adults, no matter where they live in the country, should expect a standard of accessibility in the housing stock. And so by reforming the low-income housing tax credit to both increase the requirement as well as incentivize developers to build more accessible and adaptive housing, the disabled people and older adults will increase our confidence level and the standard, as well as create more uniformity across the development field about what is accessible housing and how can LIHTC ensure that it drives not just affordable housing, but more accessible and adaptable to all.
So you said 28 states
completely lack tax credit accessibility requirements. And then there's 22 states that vary in their accessibility requirements. And so we look to the federal government for leadership in that regard.
Well, that's an interesting breakdown of all the states. I guess one question I have is, what are the characteristics of housing that's designed for the needs of people with disabilities? Kind of describe what would be, for lack of a better word, the ideal circumstance.
Thank you, Chairman. So at the Kelsey, and when we talk about disability-forward housing design, we look at cross-disability access. So that means not just meeting the minimum code requirements when they do exist, which is mobility and sensory, so important, but the 61 million disabled people we are an incredibly diverse group. And so we break down those characteristics of access in 6 main impact areas. So hearing and acoustics, vision, health and wellness, cognitive access, and support needs. Some of the features and characteristics that I want to lift up that go beyond code requirements, but by embedding them from the start doesn't have an additional cost, are things like plain language leases, are things like wayfinding in a building that when you implement these accessibility, these cross-disability access characteristics, it doesn't just benefit those groups, but benefits all.
Thanks very much. I'll turn to Ranking Member Braun.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Wajda, you talked about in Indiana the median home price